In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to debug an application in VisualStudio.net. What does it mean to debug an application? It simply means that we get to stop the execution of our source code and inspect all the values that are stored in the variables and the properties of objects that are currently in the scope of the code that's currently executing. It allows us to peek behind the scenes and discover the source of problems that might be occurring in our applications by slowly watching each line of code as it executes. Now, I rely on these tools daily as a software developer, and I think you'll find the greatest amount of benefit by practicing some of the things that I'm going to demonstrate in this video. Because not only does it help you learn about debugging, but it's also going to help you pick apart other people's programs and figure out how applications work and how they're running and how they're designed. So maybe the first thing that I do when I get assigned to maintain an existing application that was written by somebody else, or maybe I've been asked to help fix an application that's behind on schedule and there's still a lot of issues and bugs, what I'll invariably do is sit down and start analyzing the application by going through each of the buttons on the user interface. So I might just start clicking around and looking at the lines of code and start setting some breakpoints and stepping through each line of code. This helps me to understand better what the application is doing, how it's getting started, and so on. So I use it as a learning tool in addition to using it as a debugging tool. So what does it mean to set a breakpoint? Well, a breakpoint is simply a stop sign. It tells the .NET runtime that's currently executing our application to stop running the application, and then instead we want to control how the code is executed from this point on. We're going to walk through the code and we're going to do it at our own pace. So as you can see, I have Lesson 19's source code open, and what I want to do is observe this application as it runs to exercise the debugging features of VisualStudio.net. So right now I'm going to set a new breakpoint, and to do that I'm going to click in this little gray area off to the left hand side of the code view near where the line of code that I want to set the breakpoint at. So in this case I'm going to go ahead and click with my left mouse button here, and all of a sudden you'll see a little red dot and then a red line that highlights the fact that I've just set a breakpoint. Now to get rid of that breakpoint, all I need to do is click that little red mark again, and it's gone. So it's very easy to set breakpoints in your code. You could set every line to be a breakpoint, but that would kind of be a waste of time. Additionally, if you get good with just using keyboard commands, you can hit F9 on your keyboard and it'll create a breakpoint for you on the current line of code. You can have as many breakpoints as you want in your application. There's no limit. And there's a way to manage all the breakpoints, but we're not going to talk about that right now. I'll refer you to the IDE Proficiency series for more information on how to really work with breakpoints at a professional level. And also, there's another neat thing about breakpoints, and that is that they're saved with your project. So if you close your project and you turn off your computer, the next time you open your project, your breakpoints are still there, which is very cool. So I've got one breakpoint here in my BTN find, and again, if I'm just getting started on an application, I might set some breakpoints very early into each of the button click events just to start my exploration of how the application works. Now there will be some lines of code that you won't be able to set a breakpoint on. Sometimes variable declarations don't allow you to put a breakpoint there, and in this case I can try to put a breakpoint on this line of code, but since it's the definition for a method, it's not really going to do much for me. So there are some spots where you can and you can't place breakpoints, and it'll be pretty obvious to you that the red line won't show up. So the other thing I'm going to do now is set another breakpoint in another part of my application in my shippers component. Anytime somebody starts to change the value of the company name property, I'm going to go ahead and set a breakpoint there as well. Now you'll notice in the case of properties in C# that it basically will stop anytime the company name is referenced. Now let's do a quick experiment here and see if that's still the case if I were to separate this out And now you can see that because of the way that I structure my code, the breakpoint is more specific just to the set as opposed to the entire property, the get and the set. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to now run my application, and I'm going to type in the number 2, and I'm going to click the Find button. You'll notice at this point the application performs just as we've experienced in the past with no difference. I'll click my Find button, and all of a sudden the application stops executing, and we find ourselves at the first breakpoint. So now I'm currently in what's known as debug mode. You can tell that you're in debug mode because you see a little yellow line instead of the red line that defined this line of code as being a breakpoint line. And although you can still see the outline of the red dot in the left-hand column, you also see a little yellow arrow which tells you that this is the current line of code that will execute next. At this point, this line of code has not yet executed, but it is the next line of code that's due to be executed. Earlier in this series of lessons, we talked about runtime versus design time, and you can kind of think of this as debug time. Now, you can't really make changes right now in debug time in this version of Visual Studio.net, but in future versions, you're going to be able to make changes, run a few lines of code, make a few more changes, and that's what's called coding in debug mode, which is kind of dangerous because if your application crashes while you're doing that debugging and coding, then you're going to lose all your changes, or at least that's the way that it operated in the past. Now also when we went into debug mode, there were some things that happened. First of all, you'll notice that a couple of windows appeared across the bottom. And we'll talk about just two of these in just a few moments, the locals window and the watch window. But there's also other windows that appear over here in a tabbed fashion as well, and we're not going to take the time to talk about these. But these windows, especially the locals and the watch window, will help you to get a peek at the values that are inside the properties of objects and also the variables that are currently in scope. Now also, what sometimes will appear, and for some reason it didn't appear for me here, but the debug toolbar should appear within Visual Studio whenever we get into debug mode. Now if it doesn't appear automatically, what I can do is right-click in an empty space of the toolbar here at the top, right-click and then select Debug, and you can see that a little toolbar appears here, and each of these will help us as we start to try to debug our application. We're only going to talk about a few of them right now. There's some obvious ones like the Continue button, which will continue the execution of the application past this breakpoint, or the Stop Debugging, which will just essentially stop execution and we get back into design time. And there's the Restart, which allows us to just basically stop, then restart the application. So here are some other buttons. This Show Next statement, if we were to be searching through our code to just get some more information before we continue debugging, what we can do is click this Show Next statement, and it'll bring us back to the line of code that's supposed to execute next. So if we get lost, or if we're in another file somewhere else, like let's say we're over here and we're looking at what's about to happen, then we can click this Show Next statement and it'll return us to the next line of code that should execute. And then the next three buttons are pretty crucial to our debugging, and that is the Step Into button, the Step Over button, and the Step Out button. And these allow us to navigate through the code so that we can watch a line-by-line execution of the code. So let's say, for example, that I want to watch this code execute line by line. What I'm going to do is click my Step Into button, and what Step Into does is that it will execute every line of code that it comes across, even those lines of code that we may not care about. Like there's a lot of initialization that's going on behind the scenes, and we have to watch all of this initialization code that we didn't type in, that that Visual Studio created for us as we were dragging and dropping items onto our Visual Designer. And once we have in this case, create a new shipper object and it's been initialized, then it will return back from the shippers.cs file back to our form 1. Now, let's say, for example, that we don't want to watch this get shipper actually execute. What I can do is just step over this line of code. So instead of doing this, we'll restart the application here in just a minute, but I'm going to show you what would happen instead of watching each line of code execute in my get shipper method. Maybe I don't want to watch get shipper do everything it needs to do and then be returned back. Maybe what I want to do instead, let me stop and then restart the application here. Maybe instead I want to step over this, so I don't want to watch every line. I want it to execute, but I don't want to see it happening. So you'll notice here I'm just going to click the step over button. Now all that initialization still happened, but we didn't have to watch it. And again, for get shipper, I'm just going to select step over, and now I don't have to see any of it executing, because that's not what I really want to focus on. I don't have to waste time stepping through all those lines of code. Now there's one other option. What if you accidentally get yourself into a situation where you're deep into one method, calling another method, and you're deep down in a tree of code? For example, let's step over this line and then step into this line. So I'm in the get shipper and I'm like, oh, I don't want to be here. I don't want to review any more of this code. I can select the step out, which will continue to execute all of this code, but I don't have to watch it. It'll return me back to the code that called the get shipper method, and now I'm on the next line of code. Now additionally, I can hit the continue button and the code will run until it finds the next breakpoint, and if this isn't where I want to stop, I can select continue again, and it may hit another breakpoint, but in this case we didn't have any more breakpoints to find, so it just continues on with the normal execution of the application. Now in all honesty, I usually don't use the toolbar buttons. Whenever I'm debugging, I use the keyboard shortcuts. The F9, we already said that creates a breakpoint for us. The F10 allows you to step in, and the F11 allows you to step over. So you may want to keep those in mind and try them yourself just to make sure, because you can navigate through code, I believe, a lot faster by using your keyboard than you can with your mouse. Let's take a moment now to look at some of the windows that pop open while you're in debug mode. And one of them is the locals window. And the locals window shows the value of each object or variable that's currently in scope. So for example, we have 3 objects that are currently in scope in the btn find click event. First of all, the word this. And this refers to the current object. In this case, it is the form that houses the btn find click method and so on. So the class that contains the form, it will have references to btn delete, since it's a child of the form, the find button, the new button, the label controls, as you see here, the text controls, and so on. So now you can see, for example, this txt shipper ID, I can expand that and look at the properties of that object. And I can scroll down and see that the text property currently is set to the value 2. So not only can we look at the values in their hierarchical structure within in the class hierarchy, but we can also look at the value of properties of our objects and then also see what data type they are. Now there's also 2 other objects here, the sender object and the E object, and both of those are passed in as arguments to our btn click event. These are things that are automatically passed in by the .NET runtime and things that we don't have to really worry about. But we could still see, for example, who the sender is. It was the find button that was clicked. Let's go ahead and select the Continue button, which will allow us to hit our next breakpoint. And notice that the value of this has changed. We're no longer on the form, but instead this now refers to less than 19.shippers. Remember that this is a keyword that remembers or it refers to the current class or object that you're working in at that period in time. So for example, I can drill down and look at the private member variables, company name, phone, shipper ID, and you'll see the values and their types. We can see the command objects that we dragged and dropped onto the designer surface, the connection object, and then the values of the properties. We can also see the value of our keyword value, which is United Packages. Now, one thing that I didn't talk about up to this point, but I think I referred to briefly in previous videos, was the fact that you don't need the locals or the watch window to see the value of a given variable. All you need to do is hover your mouse cursor over a variable or a property, and it will show a little yellow box with the name of the identifier, in this case underscore company name, and then its value. United Packages is the current value. So let's move on and talk now about the watch window. And the watch window basically allows you to find which variables and objects that you want to keep an eye on across all of the objects and properties and variables across your entire project. So in case of an object that has a more global scope, you can continue to watch the value of something. Also, it allows you to refine and just have a small list of those properties and variables that you want to keep an eye on, instead of having to weed through the entire list of locals that are available here. So for example, when I go to the watch window, to add company name to the watch window, all I'll do is just drag it and drop it, and you can see now that I have the watch window. It now has company name, it has a current value, and the type string. It looks a lot like the locals window, but now I can just refine which items I'm interested in. So let me pick phone as well. I'm just going to highlight phone, and I'm going to drop it down here. Now let's go ahead and step into the next line of code. In fact, let's go ahead and continue the application. And what I want to do now is change package to, or packages to package, and just change and just get rid of the S. And when I do, I hit my breakpoint again, because anytime a set occurs, we want to review what's going to happen. And now we can hover our mouse cursor and see we're about to change the value of our private member field company name into United Package. The current value, though, is packages. And so I'm going to step in one line of code, and I want you to notice what happens. Notice that the value changes in the watch window. This lets me know that the variable or the property, the value in it has changed, and it just brings that to my attention in a very visual way by turning the text red. Now this will only work for the next line of code, so if I were to use the step into one more time, you'll notice that it goes away. In fact, because it's fallen out of scope, we can't even see the value of those variables. So once again, scope plays a pretty important role in debugging your applications and being able to see the current values. So these tools are valuable because they allow us to spy inside the code as it's executing and observe the values of variables and objects and their properties. There's a ton of other techniques I could show you, like managing breakpoints or temporarily enabling and disabling breakpoints. There are a couple of helpful videos already on this topic in the IDE Proficiency series on LearnVisualStudio.net. But the simple concepts I demonstrate in this video will help you get a long way in understanding how your code works. And that will lead to more stable code, or at least the reduction of possible bugs in your application, or to do the same with code that somebody else has written. or to learn how that code actually works. So I recommend that you flex those debugging muscles, that you open up Lesson 19 source code on your own computer, or open up any other project that we've worked on together, and try to do what I've demonstrated here. Step through the code and see if you can get the hang of it using both the debug toolbar and the keyboard shortcuts that I described. Use the different debug windows, the watch and the local window. Use those, get a hang for it, and then start incorporating that into the development process. So I wish you happy debugging.